Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good morning. I would like us to start our plenary meeting this morning. May I ask you to take your seats, please? I know it's a little bit difficult after such a lovely evening. Annick and Janos, you know what we've now caused. People had a good evening last night, and now I hope we'll not have a slow beginning today. But again, thank you for that evening. I enjoyed it very much. Right. I would like to welcome everybody to this session, which is going to deal with governance and governance for transformation and in terms of implementing the Nexus. A very exciting topic to me, and I think, and I hope to many of you. And when I listened to the discussions yesterday, governance always occurred, whether people were discussing about tools, about the content, many other aspects related to the Nexus. Governance seems to have been at the core of it. Now, and indeed it should be, because it's key to the implementation of the Nexus. And yesterday we had that IWRM and the Nexus are the two sides of the same coin. We also had that maybe that there's no need to create new institutions, and that we must try to work with the existing ones, because directing ourselves to creating new institutions might take us too much energy, and perhaps we will not succeed in the end. But we also had that we are struggling to reach out to other sectors. Planning and implementation in the various sectors is taking place in silos. We don't have common platforms to discuss issues of the Nexus. For example, water, energy, food, coming together, such platforms are not there. Our approaches seem to be different, and even the language maybe is different. Now, the challenge that perhaps we are going to be dealing with this morning is to find out how do we overcome these challenges. How can governance help us to overcome these challenges? And here we're talking about how governance institutions, structures, that is, processes, and incentives. The question is, are they enough? If not, where are the gaps? And what needs to be done? These are some of the pertinent issues that I hope this will be dealing with this morning. And for this, we have a group leading global experts on the governance-related issues who are going to give us insights as to how these issues are, our status, where opportunities are, the challenges are, and give us some recommendations on how to move forward. And we are privileged to have 4 experts here who are going to present. Unfortunately, the 5th one could not make it, Albert Patula. He would have been also a very interesting presenter to hear because he served as former Minister of Water and Energy. And when I was talking to him about his experience as minister, he told me that, look, myself, I can talk about governance issues related to the Nexus, because what I used to do is I would go and talk in the budget cycles, I would go and talk about the budget for water, finish it with the Minister of Planning and Finance, and then maybe 3-4 weeks later, I'll go and talk to him about the budget in the Ministry of Energy, about energy. We never, even as I was one decision maker, we never had a common platform to discuss the issues so that we could look at the synergies and avoid a lot of trade-offs that are harmful. So unfortunately, couldn't make it due to last-minute emergencies in his family, but we have very eminent people here, scientists and practitioners that would be able to illuminate us on this issue of governance. And how we're going to go about it is I will invite them all, one after the other, and invite them to make their keynote speeches. Today it's a little bit different than yesterday. They will present keynote speeches, and then we follow that up with a short plenary discussion on issues, to clarify issues, but also to maybe to discuss some of the key issues that will have come out from their presentations. Then we'll move on to the next one. And then towards the end, they all sit up there, and then we will have some form of plenary discussions to discuss some of the common issues or issues that will have emerged from the various presentations. So that's how we've organized our day today. And as the first speaker, I would like to call Joachim. Joachim von Braun. Joachim, I understand you are an agricultural economist by background. He is currently the executive director of the Center for Development Research of the University of Bonn. And in his former career, Joachim was the Director General of IFPRI. This is an International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington. And when I was talking to him very briefly earlier on, he said he stayed, is it more than 12 years or 18 years outside Germany in different places, including Egypt and so on. And he's also a member of various academic associations. Joachim, could you please come and give us your keynote speech? And thank you again for agreeing to come and share with us your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for the kind introduction. Good morning, colleagues. I appreciate that despite of a pleasant party last night, you have come out early. And I'm happy to address you this morning. May I ask for my PowerPoints, or do I have to do that from here? Well, so this talk is about governing the Nexus, what and how. I'm really delighted about the dynamics of Nexus research, Nexus policy making, Nexus talking, following the big Nexus conference here in Bonn. It has become a globally adopted approach. But in this talk, I will underline that we are not yet there, that quite a number of things in implementation need to move forward in order to have an impact with the Nexus approach. You know this graph. I've slightly manipulated it. I've put people into the center, and I've highlighted the issues of governance and innovation on the right-hand side of the well-known Nexus framework. That's what I'm going to talk about. The goals of the Nexus, the what, should be pretty clearly understood. We want to accelerate access to water, food, energy services for all of high quality. We need to produce more with less and waste, minimize losses. So get efficiency in the Nexus-related economic systems. We need to protect nature, sustainably manage natural resources and ecosystems. A set of instruments need to be employed for the how-to achieving these Nexus goals. The often quoted silos, synergies, but also mobilization of citizens is part of it. A set of principles should guide our actions in the Nexus domains. Serving people and serving ecology does sometimes conflict with each other. So Nexus is easy to buy in, but when you come down to implementation, there are conflicts, there are trade-offs. In the governance agenda, the how-to needs to focus on at least 3 domains. establish legal basis for Nexus. We are far away from that. Establish administrative arrangements for Nexus. Some exist, but they are too weak. That's why we push this agenda. And facilitate collective action. Again, a set of instruments need to be employed efficiently and in complementary ways, incentives, regulation, empowerment, and so on. And that's where things get complicated. What set of instruments for what objective? Let me point out two big challenges, which I feel are not well addressed so far. Number one, the complexity and dynamics of the interconnected systems of water, energy, and food. I underline the dynamics need to be in focus. We are not dealing with some standing silos which you need to connect. These silos are moving. The issues they need to address are moving. There are trends. There are risks and uncertainties and extreme events, tipping points in each of the subsystems we are addressing, and there are changing positive and negative externalities. That's why and that's my first plea in this talk, we need to come to an integration of Nexus with resilience approach. A Nexus which has no time subscript, no T on a dynamically changing, volatile development path is no good. It fails in the risky situations. So we need to bring in resilience approach, dealing with risks and uncertainties. And we need to capture the critical functionalities of systems. So in the water, the energy systems have failures, the critical functionalities are impaired, the food system is in trouble, and vice versa. So we need to look across the three domains, but the key point here is Nexus and resilience approach need to come together, and that's going to be, I'll amplify that at the end of this talk. The other big challenge is hard economics of Nexus. I'm afraid we haven't talked enough economics and political economy of a Nexus implementation. We need to optimize, not maximize investment in Nexus and resilience. Yeah? Let's get lots of Nexus would be the wrong approach. We need an optimal balance between Nexus and sector-specific actions. We need to assess, in order to come to optimization, the transactions cost of Nexus governance, because it costs, Nexus costs money, time, political capital. So we need a realism regarding Nexus political economy. But I think we need a clearly defined agenda, practical agenda, research agenda on the hard economics of the Nexus. I don't see that sufficiently at this stage. In the remaining part of my presentation, I will highlight 3 Nexus governance hotspots. I know there are more, but I feel these are particularly important. One is governance across scales, the other across sectors, and then governance of innovation, and innovation for governance. Those are the 3 hotspots I would like to briefly touch upon. Hotspot number 1, Nexus governance across scales is really a critical matter. If you look at food and water and energy and climate, the governance at different scales, local, national, global, matter in very different ways. Some of the issues, the domains are largely ungoverned, such as climate, although there is the well-known attempt to get it more governed. So how? I promised you to talk about what and how, and emphasize the how to address this. We need to get to integrated implementation of Nexus following subsidiarity principles. Do what can be done best at the decentralized level, at the national level, at the global level. So we need to sort out the priority areas. If you look at a map, which we have produced at CEF, our institute, which tries to bring together governance quality indicators with ecology, productivity, and poverty indicators, a people-serving Nexus governance approach needs to deal with this very complex map. Local challenges differ, and we need mapping in this respect of how marginality and quality of governance come together. Let me give you an example at global level and come from the food side at it. Food-related public goods that need global Nexus governance or even government. I don't go through the 7 points. Just take note that there are at least 7 critical global public goods related to the food system which need institutional arrangements for governance. And each of the 7 global public goods, from food safety to joint stockholding and food reserves, has a different connection to, say, water and energy. But there are the connections. So come conceptually, I argue, from a global public goods perspective. Don't make it the list too large. This is probably too long, but I didn't feel I can cut it back, and see what needs to be governed there. Hotspot number 2. The larger transformation through biologizing the economy, not economizing the biology, is at the center of a green growth strategy. We call it bioeconomy. It brings water, energy, and food nexus together for a competitive, sustainable growth strategy. It draws on biomass, industrial biotechnology, utilization of carbon, etc. So while we tend to talk about public governance, we also need to look at private governance issues. If the two are not properly handled, we get into trouble. The nexus in the bioeconomy, and only look at the lower part of this slide, cuts across many sectors, economic sectors, including chemical industry, fiber, textiles, and so on, many of which have their regulatory problems. So I highlight that if we want, which I hope we do, a green growth strategy with a strong core of bioeconomy in it, we are confronted with bringing a whole set of sector growth strategies together for sustainable use of natural resources. Hotspot number 3, innovations for Nexus governance. Governance depends on innovations to tap Nexus opportunities. So we need to have a support infrastructure for innovation on which governance can draw. I think we need an entirely different footprint analysis, a global footprint analysis, which is a lot more comprehensive, which goes beyond the individual net footprint analysis, say the water footprint, the land use and soil degradation footprint, the energy CO2 or greenhouse gas emission footprint. How to bring them together and signal to consumers and industry performance. And how to make it stick, give it even a legal base in value chains. Let me not focus on the rest of the other 2 examples. You can glance at them. We certainly need innovation in order to guide the implementation capacity of Nexus. The way forward, to conclude my talk with this slide, with Nexus governance, I think we have to be fully aware of the constraints we are facing when we talk governance. The sectoral forces and line ministries are strong and defensive. They will try to capture their piece of Nexus or fight for their special interest domains. There's no doubt about that. The opportunities are that the Sustainable Development Goal implementation will not function without sound Nexus governance, which would guide the choices of instruments and investments. That's why we need Nexus economics. With the Nexus, the chances are much better to get the Sustainable Development Goals implemented efficiently and effectively for results at the people level. So I think we have to have a very critical assessment of the constraints in order to tap the benefits. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, Joachim, thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation and very thought-provoking presentation, Joachim. I've noticed the last point here. It's about the SDG. So I would like to ask you and maybe other presenters later to think about what kind of indicators would you propose that would be promote the implementation of the Nexus. That will be my last question at the end of the session to each one of you, so that you can help us move the agenda a little bit forward. Now, I would like to invite questions to Joachim's presentation. Questions regarding clarification or any other points that you think came out particularly well from his presentation. This is the only mic.
I see someone over there at the window. Thomas, there's also someone over there. I haven't seen.
There's one there, another was followed by someone there. Who's first? This one. Someone there. Where you are? There.
Huh?
Yes, hello. My name is Ulrike Pokorski from GIZ, and I would very much like to support what you said about the need for integrated footprints. Do you have any idea, however, how to tackle the fact that they have impacts on different scales? Like while energy, CO2, carbon footprints are global, water footprints tend to be more local. Do you have any idea on how to tackle this in an integrated assessment, in an integrated footprint?
Thomas, do you want me to answer immediately? Well, I think doing footprint analysis, global, national, local, is a challenge. I think to begin with, it would be good to have a global footprint assessment so that the big issue of transnational net importation of water from scarce regions and of land from land scarce and land degrading regions are signaled to trade and to consumers. At the national level, I think the knowledge of people and the regulatory regimes can take care of it. That's where I would not put the initial emphasis. The lack of knowledge is that you and I don't know what's our indirect land use footprint, CO2 footprint, and water footprint as consumers and as investors in Germany, and that needs to be dealt with. And to bring them together, I think a thoughtful weighing exercise based on factor analysis and playing with it. The technicalities of this are a number of doctoral dissertations, but it's not trivial, I agree.
Thank you very much. There's someone there. Was it you?
Somebody has a mic.
That was my question as well. Yes, thank you very much. Holger Hoff is my name. Yes, indeed, there will be a number of sectoral inertia in many ways to work against or delay a Nexus approach, but I wanted to ask you about your experience, whether there are allies, whether there are institutions that are set up or that understand themselves as Nexus institutions, bridging across sectors where it's promising to start from.
Definitely there are. And I think the real impact of Nexus conferencing, teaching, conversations is already visible. If you look at, for instance, how the global food organizations before the food crisis were dealing with their problems on production, scarcities, etc., in isolation, that's no longer that much the case at all. So there is talk across among them, and for instance, with the energy organizations in Vienna and locally with the river basin organizations on water. So I see progress. I'm quite encouraged by that, but it's not yet good enough. The problem is, I think, still with ministries at national level. That's where the biggest sticking problems are, and I think it needs encouragement of senior political leaders to cut across ministerial silos and give their ministers incentives that they don't look only at their own sectoral priorities.
I'm Professor Duhovny from Central Asia. The Nexus for the last years transformed in the proper, very popular slogan. But what is the main resistance to this slogan? It is the behavior of human behavior on the different level, especially on the topest level, where the ambitions of leader is the main opposition to creation of Nexus on the state level, on the sector level. How are you looking on the mechanism of overcome this obstacle?
So I fully agree with you, and the incentives for sector leaders, be they in the political or in the civil society domain, to look for the broader impact of their doing needs to be revisited. I think we in the research community need to point out where Nexus opportunities are lost, where they are not tapped, and communicate that. And that's why we need strong Nexus economics work. Simply saying, get out of your silos, work together, the common public good is otherwise not achieved, is not good enough. We need to demonstrate to ministers of economy and finance and head of state that if the Nexus economics are violated and the synergy opportunities are not achieved, they are losing billions of national income.
Is it? Okay. Well, yeah, my question is also an observation on the discussion we had yesterday. Because there are, and if you look at the developing world, there are a lot of institutions that try to do this, interministerial apex bodies, interministerial bodies and stuff, and few of them actually work. So these have been set up to make high-level political coordination between sectors, but they rarely function, rarely meet. And the message hasn't gotten across to them. We have a lot of discussion here also about Nexus in the transboundary, and Victor knows all of that from RLC, where Nexus is very much a question of energy in upstream countries versus agriculture and downstream countries and so forth. Again, we have institutions that in principle can make these bridges, but in practice do not. So I think rather than talking about new integrated governance and so forth, let's focus on making those institutions work that we actually have and see how we can communicate to them that this is the agenda they should look at.
Thank you. Jalilov from Aalto University, Finland. When you say there is need for a new political economy of Nexus, what do you mean by this? Because as a political economy, it's already like in 17th, 18th centuries, it's already there. I think we should just get it and try to apply to Nexus, rather than just speaking we need a political economy, because all this political economy, it's economics related to ideology. All this communism, capitalism, socialism, what kind of ideology do you see here in Nexus issues? And another clarification, when you say we need optimization but not maximization, the whole idea of economics is maximizing the utility. Just a clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joachim, for this very inspiring presentation. You say SDG implementation needs sound Nexus governance, as a Global Water Partnership, like many others, is very much and closely following the SDG negotiations, discussions, and well, we are very much in favor of a dedicated water goal, but also then having the linkages to the other important goals, which in a way is also the Nexus. What would you then do in order to properly get this message across to the politicians and to those in New York, the New York gang, who are discussing the SDG agenda and how to move forward? Thank you.
I'll start with the last. In the end, the SDGs will not be written by a New York gang. The political process is global. And when they come together in the end, drafts will be changed. So I'm quite optimistic that an SDG agenda which has a strong focus on sustainable economic growth with jobs will have a strong emphasis on the central elements of health, food, and that's where water is the core element. So I think the whole notion of sustainable development driven from the developing country and emerging economy side will this time around focus much more on the health environment around small and large cities, and again, water is at the core. So I think those are your allies to make sure that water, which currently in many of the scriptures does not figure as a goal, comes in. And if it doesn't come in as a goal, then your second line of defense should be to make it absolutely instrumental for a set of health, food, and other goals. I think what's new regarding political economy is that we live in a more crowded and integrated world. You referred to the 18th, 19th century, and that the externalities in this globally crowded world are very, very different. And that's why we need to address them in order to protect the global public goods for humanity also in the future. We didn't need global policies in the 18th and 19th century. The fundamental principles of political economy have also changed. It is, and are changing constantly, a multipolar world with a demand for public goods, which citizens articulate also to their more or less democratic government. So I think we need to take these tendencies in account, and they will only strengthen over the next generation in a world moving from 7 to 9 billion. I think it's a very fair point that institutions and organizations exist, and they need to be strengthened in order to deliver on Nexus. I couldn't agree more. Having said that, I find it, however, important that we don't get locked into a debate where it will be very difficult to win when we argue, hey, creates a Nexus ministry or creates a ministry for follow-up or so. That's a no-winner. Ministries which are supposed, or bodies are supposed to coordinate and don't have a budget line and don't have power, have no chance. So I don't want to be the minister for follow-up on Nexus, or sit in the, and you neither, and sit in the Prime Minister's office. I mean, saying it jokingly. So I think an integrated approach. Let me refer to an example from Germany, which I'm really quite impressed by. I'm chairing Germany's Bioeconomy Council. Initially, that was 2 ministries which cautiously came together, food and agriculture and science. Nowadays, 8 ministries sit in our council, and they have just, by agreement of the federal cabinet, create an interministerial consultation group where they battle and wrestle with Nexus issues here in Germany, including international aspects. And from all what I know, these are tough discussions. I want them to sit there and have tough discussions on how to move forward and have a give and take debate. So strong interministerial council structures can be strengthened and need to be watched from the outside. Thank you very much.
Joachim, thank you very much for your presentation and your answers to the questions and the issues that you've raised. That we cannot rely on the current situations, institutions, neither can we create new ones. We have to find some way in between. I think that's very wise. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dirk Messner. Dirk is the director of DIE, the German Development Institute, and he also serves as a professor at the University of Essen-Duisburg. He's a political scientist by background. That's what I got to know. And he is the co-chair of the advisory committee of the federal government of Germany in global environmental challenges. So, Dirk, could you please come forward and give us your keynote speech? Thank you very much.
So, I'm not going to work with Joachim's PowerPoint, obviously. Okay. Fine. How we go out of there? Okay. So, dear colleagues, good morning. I will work without PowerPoint this day, and I would like to focus on different perspectives. At the end of my talk, I will focus on 3 different perspectives on how to think about governance on the Nexus dimensions. And I would like to focus first on the local and national dimensions of governing the Nexus challenges. Then I would like to go to the broader debate on governing the transformation towards sustainability in a broader sense and impact of these broader transformation processes for the Nexus challenges. And then I will finish with reflections on global planetary boundaries and Nexus. And this will be linked to the debate on 2015 goals and sustainable development goals. So let's start first with the question of national and local management of the Nexus challenges, which Joachim already talked about. And the keywords here are obvious. It is about comprehensive governance schemes. It is about overcoming silos. It is about managing different resources in an integrated framework. And the question here is, why is this so difficult and what do we need to focus on? And I would like to mention only 4 different elements which are key here when it comes to managing on local and national areas the Nexus governance. And I think this will echo a bit what Joachim already reflected on. Why is this comprehensive approach so difficult? And the first thing which I would like to focus on here regarding the local and national management is that we need successes and progress when it comes to modeling the Nexus dimensions in the Nexus interactions at local and national scales. And there are a lot of things moving on in many countries, which is very important because we have to understand still the interdependencies, trade-offs, and also co-benefits regarding Nexus better than we do currently. Co-benefits are very important because if you like to convince ministries or different people from different sectors to work together, demonstrating benefits and co-benefits is obviously very important. So making progress in terms of modeling activities is my first point, which I wanted to highlight. The second thing is then the governance issue in a more narrow sense, so overcoming silos. Joachim already reflected on this. This is always very important in any interdependent field. This is not only relevant for Nexus, this is relevant for many other issues where different sectors and resources are coming together. So you are confronted with different ministries which need to coordinate. You are confronted with different communities in ministries, but also civil societies and private sector with different mindsets, different toolboxes, different path dependencies and institutions. So bringing this together is very difficult. In terms of the Nexus challenges, very often we have to organize not only negative coordination, this is a political science terminology. Negative coordination implies that ministries try to organize in a complementary way. So I do my stuff, you do your stuff, but we know what we are doing each other. When it comes to the co-benefits in the field of the Nexus, positive coordination is very important. So organizing synergies implies that ministries from day to day need to coordinate their activities in a positive way. We know that this is absolutely difficult. So my suggestion here would be try to focus in each sectoral context, in each local context, on the most important things where you really would like to go for positive coordination, because positive coordination is very challenging. So this is the second point then. It is about organizing interministerial dialogues, interministerial policy making, which is complex, focus on the most important things to really go for positive coordination. And I'm talking here about the technocratic dimension, actually, the technical dimension of managing the Nexus. The third element, which I would like to focus on, still talking about local and national Nexus governance, is that even if we would have the perfect institutional designs regarding Nexus in specific contexts, at the end of the day, we are talking about scarce resources, and therefore we are talking about distributional conflicts. And therefore we are talking about power struggle and power conflict arenas. What I would like to say is it is about the political economy of these kind of conflicts, and we need to have these political struggles in mind. Even having first best institutional designs, political economy analysis is very important, and on the ground, good governance is relevant. So embedding this kind of distributional conflicts, which we cannot solve in a way, we can only embed them, implies that checks and balances mechanisms in societies and countries are absolutely key to get good results out. This is my third point then. Managing distributional conflicts is unavoidable. Power is therefore a critical aspect. Political economy analysis is absolutely key. And good governance in the sense of embed this kind of power struggles and distributional conflicts is something which goes beyond perfect institutional designs. So my last point then regarding the local and national governance of the Nexus is please let us learn from Elinor Ostrom again, because she has been working so much on managing local commons and also global commons, but in this case it is about local commons. So her approach was, and this has to do with my last point, distributional conflicts and power struggles, let's bring multi-stakeholder coalitions into the process of managing the local Nexus challenges. So bringing the actors around tables and moderating these kind of actor constellations is something which has been proven is very important for getting good Nexus governance on the table. It's not only about ministries and good public institutions, it is about multi-stakeholder engagement. And what we has been learning from Elinor Ostrom is that this is absolutely key for getting local commons right, and this is also the case in the field of the Nexus governance. Science can play a vital role here. This is reflecting about transdisciplinary science. So bringing scientists with their knowledge on local contexts into the debates might help. Research can play a proactive role here beyond only writing perfect and well-designed research papers. Knowledge is important in the political process, in the interface between science and political dynamics. So this has been my reflections on managing the Nexus issue on the ground, locally and nationally, with the 4 dimensions which I managed. The second point which I would like to focus on briefly is there are other global dimensions which are very important, which we need to understand, and which will be critical regarding the pressure which we then see on local grounds regarding our Nexus dynamics. And I would like to focus in my second stream of reflections here on 3 global development dynamics and why they are important for the Nexus and in which ways we need to think about transformation towards sustainability to get then the Nexus question framed in a more appropriate way. My first big global development dynamic, which we are going to see anyway, is the urbanization shift. So you know that currently we are having 3 billion people living in cities. We are going to see 6 billion people living in cities in only 3 decades' time. And you all know that cities, urbanization, this huge shift, doubling the urban population under business as usual conditions would imply more demand for water, more demand for food, and more demand for energy. So when we manage the urbanization shift in a business as usual pattern, the Nexus issues will be even harder to solve than currently. So we need a discussion not only about low carbon urbanization, which we have. I'm one of the guys trying to push forward the debate on low carbon urbanization. This is linked to the climate debate. But from a Nexus perspective, how we manage and shape global urbanization is absolutely key, because urbanization is about the food issue, the water issue, and the energy issue. Second point regarding global dynamics and thinking about transformation in a sustainable way of these global development dynamics, the second issue is global middle classes. We are going to see, or we are currently already seeing, a new global middle class emerging in non-OECD countries, in developing countries, in emerging economies. And this is, of course, again, about more food consumption, it's about more energy consumption, and it is about more mobility for people having access then to private cars, for example. So the way in which the new middle classes are becoming wealthier is key for the Nexus dimension also. And this goes beyond then, innovation processes. This is a question one of you talked about already in your question, the behavioral dimension of sustainability transformations. No? I would argue that in this field, global middle classes and their impact on the Nexus, the key question is, are we as human society, to say so, able to create new well-being concepts, new wealth concepts, no? Able to de-link processes of wealth creation from pressure on scarce natural resources. This is not only an innovation challenge, it is at the same time actually a cultural challenge. No? Will we be able to develop these kind of new concepts of well-being, and how are we going to be able to do that? If we are not able to do that, the Nexus challenge will be even harder than we see it already today. My third global dimension of development, which is important for the Nexus debate, is 9 billion people in 2050, or even 10 billion people in 2050. With the existing food patterns, as we all know, the pressure on land and water will be huge. So the question here is, will we as human society be able to change our food patterns? All our data are showing that this is a huge leverage. I'm not talking about marginal improvements here. If we would be able as human society to move towards a food pattern, a food consumption pattern, which the World Health Organization is defining as healthy, you know that we would eat, for example, much less meat. And this would imply much less pressure on water and soil then. So this is, again, a cultural challenge. No? Will we move towards food patterns globally which would help us to reduce the pressure on the nexus dynamics on the ground. My last point, and I'm coming to the end, 2 minutes to finish. I talked about, in my first reflections, local and national nexus governance. And I said that this is about local resource management challenges. And my last point here is that when we reflect about the nexus, it's not only about local ecosystem management. It is about understanding that we have to accept certain global planetary boundaries, and if we don't accept these, this will have impacts on the pressure on nexus dynamics on the ground. Ursula, this is something which has to do with the post-2015 debate. No? As our colleague already said, our moderator, I'm chairing the German Advisory Council on Global Change. We have been preparing a paper where we suggest that we should have one goal, identifying the most important global planetary boundaries which have an impact on human development dynamics, and in this case here, the nexus dynamics. So for the nexus dynamics, I see 4 global planetary boundaries which we need to focus on to reduce the pressure on nexus challenges. The first global dynamic, which is important, the first global goal, therefore, which we would suggest is that we need a global goal to stop netto land degradation globally and in any country on Earth by 2030. No? In order to stabilize the soil and land which is still available for agricultural purposes. So our suggestion is having a goal on that in the post-2015 debate. Soil degradation. By 2030, stopping netto loss of soil potentials on a global scale. The second important factor, the second important global boundary or guardrail is phosphor. No? As you all know, phosphor is very important, a key ingredient for agriculture. Currently, we do not have a substitute for that. No? For many challenges in the technological arenas, we do have substitutes. For phosphor, there is no substitute. Phosphor is a non-renewable resource. And the data we have are demonstrating that we might have peaked phosphor already around 1989, or we might peak phosphor production and consumption in 2030. So the data are still a bit inconclusive, but signaling clearly that phosphor is a strategic resource which we need to focus on globally, because this has obviously to do with agricultural production and therefore the nexus issue. No? So our suggestion here is that by 2050, at the latest, we should organize phosphor usage in circles. If we don't do so, we lose a strategic ingredient for agricultural production, which we can still not substitute. My third global guardrail is the climate change issue, obviously, because global warming implies pressure on water, on food, and on ecosystems. So the 2 degrees Celsius target is relevant for nexus. Joachim already said that. No? On the global level, this is an important leverage point to reduce or to strengthen still nexus dynamics on the ground. So the third element is the climate goal. And the fourth thing is something which is much less debated when it comes to the nexus question, but I think it's important. It is about the acidification of our oceans. The acidification of our oceans is translating into a situation which will have huge impacts on global fishery. And impact on global fishery and reducing global fishery results would imply that we would even more depend on agricultural products for feeding 10 billion people in 2050. So stopping acidification of oceans is key. And stopping acidification of oceans has to do again with CO2 emissions. And the important point here is that even if you would manage to stop global warming by any geoengineering tools, so stopping technically global warming, but moving forward with CO2 emissions, we would not stop the acidification of the oceans. So focusing on reducing CO2 for stopping the acidification of the oceans from a feeding perspective, 9 billion people, is therefore, from my perspective, absolutely key. So these have been my perspectives on managing the Nexus governance challenge on local and national levels on the one hand side, transformation towards sustainability regarding urbanization, global middle classes, and feeding 10 billion people. And at the end of the day, then four important global guardrails, which would help us to reduce the pressure on the nexodynamics on the ground. Thank you very much for listening.
Giving a very positive suggestions on how to improve the implementation of this Nexus in the governance arena, but also for raising some of the issues that are pertinent to you. So to justify why it is important to focus on the Nexus. We are running out of time, so I'll take very few questions and I'll ask you to be very brief. I'll take 3 questions. And one to start here.
Okay. My name is Ghulam Rasul. I'm from EC Mode International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. I appreciate very much your very elaborated perspective and good perspective, all that. I want to touch on the planetary boundaries. I think very important for that. But here you have mentioned several boundaries, several resources need to mention. As you know, the mountain as one of the important ecosystem that provides a lot of services to the global communities, water or other. So mountain ecosystem degradation will affect the whole planetary boundary. So I was wondering whether that mountain ecosystem also should could be part of one of the planetary boundary you have discussed.
Mountains. Yes. Yeah.
Graham Wynne, International Sustainability Unit. Can I thank you? Tour de force, excellent. Really very inspiring to start the day. Quick observation. Your point about multi-stakeholder engagement and management of local resources is clearly correct. I mean, I wouldn't challenge it. I'd just like to make the observation that from my experience, to get to that point, to permit, to enable, to empower multi-stakeholder management, actually at any tier, itself involves a huge culture shift and institutional shift at ministerial level, which itself entails very strong political leadership to bring that about. Because you can't actually, obviously, to make the point, have, I think, genuine multi-stakeholder management without being empowered and without having the resources devolved to do so. And therefore, we are back to the engagement at the top as well as the practical issues of how to do this at the bottom. Thank you.
We need to get the mic right at the back there. This side, there are no questions so far.
Okay.
Adrian Atkinson, New Synergies in Development, it's an NGO. Thank you very much. You're the first person who's really said something about urbanization and people living in urban areas. And I was quite shocked when I came to the conference because our little workshop is the only one that's dealing with that. It would be nice if you talk a little bit more of that. And the governance at that level, the awareness at that level of what has to be done, because this is where the problems arise. It is at the local level where people are already, and if we go to Africa and South Asia and so on, already we're seeing that there are huge problems in the Nexus area, but people at the local level, partly because they don't feel they have the power, so taking off from the last speaker, they don't have the power, and they have no idea institutionally how to do things, because the local institutions aren't really organized, and there needs to be an institutional cultural change at the local level in order to do that. I loved the way that you use Eleanor Ostrom, yeah? Because she had such a lot to say just about this. And I wondered if you would just elaborate a little bit more, on your point 2, with regard to these issues.
Okay.
It's a bit of an open question.
Yes. Okay, good. Yes. I will try to answer briefly and start with the urbanization issue, which I could talk about for hours, but I will give it a 1-minute answer here. Now, from my perspective, the urbanization debate is critical, obviously, from the demand side, no? Because urban population and the way we build our urban areas will have huge impacts on the way we consume water, food, and we organize mobility and therefore the energy sector. And this is why urban design is relevant for the Nexus debate. And the important issue I wanted to raise here is that when we talk about the Nexus dynamics, we normally focus on the rural areas where the resources are. But we have to have in mind the demand side also. And these huge shifts are are so speedy, no, that we have to focus on the most important leverage points to shift the urbanization processes towards a sustainable way, which is not at all easy because speed is most important here. And this is about path dependencies. No? If you build cities, this is having an infrastructure for the next 2 centuries. No? It's not something which you can correct easily during the next decades to come. So urbanization is absolutely key for understanding the demand side of the nexus. Then the mountains, I would argue actually, I see the importance of the mountains for from a regional perspective. So the Himalaya for the Asian region, the Andes in Latin America are absolutely key for water processes in these regions, and therefore for agriculture. I would define them as regional, or I would talk about regional boundaries here, not about global ones, no? From a methodological perspective. But the importance of these ecosystems for agriculture and human development are absolutely vital. The last question was then on multi-stakeholder dimensions, and I could not agree more, actually. This is not only a challenge for developing countries, it's also a challenge for developed countries. No? I mean, in all our OECD countries, when it comes to multi-stakeholder processes, we see that our ministries need to rethink the way they work. No? And this is, of course, even more difficult than in developing countries with authoritarian political structures. No? This is why I said the best technical institutional design does not help when it comes to these distributional conflicts, no? Because this is a question of good governance then, and it is a question of bringing people and their interests in a fair and inclusive way. No? So these are political challenges at the end of the day, and we need to have this in mind.
Dirk, thank you very much for your presentation and for your responses to the questions that we have. And I know that there are many more others, but we need to move on in the interest of time. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Claudia Pahl-Wostl. I think most of you know Claudia. She's the co-chair of GWSP. She's also professor of water resources management and director of the Environmental Systems Research Institute, I think, in Osnabrück, University of Osnabrück here in Germany. And she is a leading researcher in water governance and adaptive water management issues. Claudia, would you like to give us your keynote speech and hopefully the solutions to this whole issue of governance from or your extensive research?
Okay, yeah, I focus now on the governance of transformation. Also see that first speaker, the whole session has already the term governance on transformation in its theme, and innovation and transformation are very important. The questions I would like to address, and will agree very nicely with what we've heard from our 2 previous speakers, is what needs to be transformed, but how and to which extent can transformative change be governed, and what can and but should be the role of science in this whole context. So we already heard that we need transformation towards more horizontal and vertical coordination, horizontal across sectors, but vertical across levels, more coordination rather than huge bureaucratic structures, respect of good governance principle, but also flexible and adaptive implementation of policies. We had this discussion yesterday. We had a session mainly on governance issues and the role of horizontal and vertical coordination. And we can't foresee, so complex what we heard from Joachim from Braun, this whole issue. It's impossible to foresee all potential unintended consequences. So we need to build in mechanism structures in our policies that we still can maneuver. And that is our idea of adaptive management or adaptive policies. We are far away from being able to do so. The guiding assumption is there will be never a blueprint for the governance of the NEF, no panaceas, which we had too much panaceas in the water field, has also been clearly expressed by the 2 previous speakers. More a diagnostic approach, which maps similar classes of problems to similar classes of solutions, and more emphasis on the process of change. So the question is, what is the state of scientific understanding of societal transformations? I highlight a few elements also of research we've been doing over the past years. One stream of research is more a multi-level concept of transitions. I use the notion of transition because the whole community working with these kind of more socio-technical transitions uses transitions rather than transformation. There has been a whole stream of transition management also in the Netherlands, transition emphasizing this process element. And what the more conceptual approach, which is used there, is you have a regime, which is here. So this is the level where you really the transition takes place. That would here in our case would be the border regime, you could say. And then you have here the landscape, the macro level, where you have a lot of factors which influence, stabilize the current regime, but you also see there's a strong interdependence within the regime. You have this current structure of sectoral ministries. You have certain ways how water is managed. We heard that the current practices, how ministries did the management has been never by involving many stakeholders, and so forth and so on. So there's a strong interdependence. And now we see in the transition, we have new elements that are differently structured. We have now this micro level, the niche level, where innovative approaches are tested. They may affect the transition. But you also may have changes more from a larger scale that affect this transition, can hinder, but also support it. The question is then how the niches together with this whole changes result later in this kind of new system that one wants. That is one approach to trying to understand these complex processes. But different glance on that is some work, concept that I've been developing more using a triple loop learning concept, an evolutionary perspective on societal change. If you have here a structure that shows it comes originally from organizational science, you have certain actions that lead to outcomes, and then you have different levels of learning in terms of when the outcomes or expected outcomes don't agree or consider don't result in what the actions intend to produce. So the first step is single loop learning, incremental improvement of established routines. For example, in water scarcity, when there's running out of water, you just increase irrigation efficiencies, you divert rivers. If there's no water available, look at the big pattern that we have in China, this south-north transfer from the Yangtze to the Yellow River. But then the next stage is reframing. So what we are saying is what we have here now. We should argue in terms of is the current approach, does it make sense? We need new cross-sectoral policies, water, food, energy nexuses. So there's a change of how the problem is conceptualized. Think about land use patterns and so forth. That is also taken up quite easily by policy because it involves discourse rather than the transformation on the ground. And I think we've discussed this yesterday also that the nexus is definitely at the level of reframing. It's been taken up by a global debate already. But then the really critical step comes in transforming. And there, as I said, there's no blueprint out for that. We need new regulatory frameworks. We need change in management practice. And that is the critical step that we need to support. And the final the diagram I want to show you on this whole learning. Now we move more to the process level. That has been work. We heard about stakeholder processes. We have done quite some work on stakeholder process and developed more a relational concept for social learning. So here in the center, you see here a process. And often in the technological-oriented approach in water management or also in other kind of management, the whole process is more that certain people want to have a problem and they have a task and they want to solve it. What has often been ignored are more social relational issues, and they are key when you want to look about new ways how to deal with a problem, with a task. Social relational issues include who is in or out in such a process, who frames the problem, who says what is important, what are the boundaries, how the problem is conceptualized, and what are the rules, for example, how new kinds of approaches are adopted. So that is important to look at these kind of also participatory stakeholder processes from such a perspective and facilitate them from such a perspective to really generate coordination and innovation, that what is needed when we get them, and also deal with what we've heard, distributional conflicts that don't often have, not often, hardly ever have an easy solution. And that we need to embed these kind of processes in this larger picture that we have this landscape which is influencing the processes, but also in the end, what we intend is to have a feedback because we want to change this whole setting, as we've seen in the first picture. So this gives you some ideas of conceptual approaches that have also been used to do some analysis and compare different processes about understanding of transformative change. So when I ask the question, to which extent can transformative change be governed, these different approaches suggest it includes both a combination of purposeful design, but also quite a few processes of emergence and self-organizations, which means there's a different way of how this can be governed, and in terms of definitely it can't be controlled. So what is required for transformative change? We did this from an analysis from a whole range of studies that we have also been doing. An effective link between informal settings and formal policy processes. More informal spaces and diverse actor networks are important to support integration of knowledge, but also experimentation with innovation. But we need more connections between learning and policy processes, because that, for example, if they only hinge, which is often on individual actors, they're fragile. So they must also be codified in formal institutions and widely shared practices. So that's something that is often a critical step and doesn't take place. We need more polycentric structures with flexible and effective coordination across sectoral and administrative boundaries. As in polycentric structures mean a distribution of power, but also effective coordination. Again, we did quite a bit of analysis, and it's key that these two elements are combined. Many decentralization reforms have resulted in fragmentation, rather, in this kind of polycentric structure. Also one concept that was very strongly promoted by Lynn Ostrom, but also generally from a complex system understanding. That is what you really consider that is required to increase resilience, to increase the ability to deal with unintended consequences. And also we need a combination of governance modes that, at least for me, is very closely linked to realizing polycentric systems. Markets, bureaucratic hierarchies, networks. So we've seen through the whole range, if you look at water policy, a whole fashion moving only, first it was only government, then market could solve it all. Now at the moment, everyone looks at networks. So in the end, what is turning out very clearly, we need to find ways how these three kind of, we would say, governance modes, governance approaches, governance logics to coordinate, to govern, are better combined also here. And I think it's key also for the Nexus. And finally, also, we need continuity and also patience. Change takes place on timescales of years and decades. And we've heard yesterday also from Fritz Holzer that this is one of the problems, sometimes definitely also with policy, but we need to find continuity in this kind of process of change. Now, trajectory of change, building transformative capacity. We have, as I said, we have done some analysis in terms of polycentric structures, and what turns out for coordination is that the effectiveness of formal institution and institutional capacity is even more important than economic development. That was clearly shown on data. So what you have here is an approach that was originally developed by Helmke and Lewicki. They looked at this kind of framework to organize a relationship between formal and informal institutions, and formal is law. And one good governance principle is to comply with the rule of law. And so you have here if formal institutions are effective or if they are ineffective, and here do they have compatible goals or do they have conflicting goals? And what we aim for is more this idea when I said we need better integration of formal and informal processes, we need this innovation with policy processes, we have more this complementarity between formal and informal institutions. But far more often, we are here where they compete. So we have a lack of coherence, where you have what we could also measure is sometimes we measure it in some of our data with the corruption perception index, where you have parallel structures where decisions are made and which often are not in the interest neither of economic, ecological, or of social sustainability. It's more rent-seeking individuals that in the end are dominating. And the question is how to improve this, which I think is a problem in many developing countries, but also would say in countries where institutional frameworks are not so strong. These probably are more often than one would hope. So one pathway, and that would also agree very much so with the work of Elina Ostrom, what we heard before, is to strengthen and much more the local level. So we have substitutive, to give more freedom to those people who really experience problems, and what we already see happening, that they start to also not replace a formal institution, and you need both. I think also Ostrom's work was very clearly showing you need government together with some freedom at the local level. But I think this is the kind of pathway where, in the end, that's what I would claim, we need to come to this kind of state. So what is the role of science? Coming closely to an end. The scientific challenge ahead, what we are needing is that we need more coordinated action research to study and support learning and innovation. Co-design of sustainable development trajectories, I think that is key. We need to combine the whole Nexus ideas or Nexus approach with development, and that the sustainability principles are not respected in sequence, but from the beginning together. Development of indicators at different levels to support progress, and also these reflective processes, these adaptive policies. So that is, I think, a key issue. And more comparative studies, so a development of these global knowledge bases. And those of you who have been here on the first day in the morning, Charlie Varashmati outlined already that we intend to move, we are in the phase of moving in a new stage, in a new program, successor of the Global Water System Project, the Sustainable Water Future Program. And one important element is here that we will have these innovation and assessment platforms. So I've located this here. When you remember, there has been this graph with learning processes. Here we have multi-stakeholder processes where science is sometimes a facilitator, but an important actor take place. I could see this very much at a regional level, where problems are prevalent, where you really need to integrate across these various sectoral boundaries. That is then feeding back to more actor levels. So we heard yesterday from Jakob Riener, how do you make effective science policy transfer? You really need to engage people in, this could be kind of boundary platforms, where, and again, there is a feedback. Here could be the scientific community party related, but also policy community. And finally, this feeds into a societal system, into a discourse on transformation. So that's a bit, you could conceptualize how I also see how this new program would be part of building these global and connected platforms that would feed into these transformative processes and improve knowledge generation. But also not only challenges for science, but also something on political action in demand. We obviously need more responsible governance, monetary progress have to be set, and we need also a design and implementation of more adaptive policies, and in particular also, I think the key issue that we need respect and monitoring of compliance with good governance principles. I should say we have also from this conference, we will formulate a bit stronger policy messages, or a longer, which I will also present there at the end, but that is, I think, two important points that I want to make at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for making us understand a little more about what this governance is all about and what possible solutions there are. I'll take a few questions.
If there are none, we can also move on, because I think we are short in time, is it?
Okay, all right. Perhaps you can, if there are no questions, let's move on to the next one. Claudia, thank you again for your very detailed presentation. Our next speaker is Annukka. Annukka is a geologist by background, and she used to work for UNESCO IHP, and she is now working with the UNECE and Secretariat of the Convention of the Transboundary Waters. And currently, she's coordinating an assessment of water, food, energy ecosystems nexus in transboundary basins. Annukka, please, if you could give us your keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organizers for kindly inviting me into such prestigious company after such visionary presentations. it's challenging to provide my insights, but let's see. Hopefully this gives something new to the discussion. At least so far I've felt that the transboundary dimension to the Nexus is often not recalled or paid so much attention to. And sometimes powerful reminders come that it's the national boundaries are not respected by water. So whatever measures are taken, like the development of dams, the development of agriculture, and the way it affects the basin's response to floods, for example, all these have intersectoral repercussions that need to be carefully considered. For the past couple of days, the lower part of the Sava Basin has been struggling with heavy flooding as a result of intense rainfall in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia and Croatia. And here, if you would imagine, it wasn't, I don't think it was a big factor in this case, but if the hydropower infrastructure, for example, was really geared, optimized to generate hydropower, and the reservoirs would have been full, and then heavy rainfall would have fallen there, limiting the capacity of flood response, this obviously could have very serious consequences across borders. And it's not only that consequences come from upstream developments, but also downstream is very important for the response. Like in this case, to alleviate the situation with flooding, the Iron Gates dam operated jointly by as cooperation of Romania and Serbia, that really was a key to discharge more water to respond to this situation. And also, well, in the case of water quality, the land-based sources from basins have a big impact in the coastal zone, of course, also in the recipient seas. So in the case of the Sava, the irony of the situation was that there's a flood protection protocol to the Sava framework agreement, but Serbia, for example, that suffered the most from this situation, didn't actually yet ratify that. So let's say exchange of emergency contacts, for example, and other procedures were not yet in place. But maybe such situations can help move transboundary cooperation also forward. But what does this transboundary dimension, what does it entail in the Nexus? Of course, friction, often it's about countries having very different economic situations and objectives, and this causes even more so friction than at the national level. Also because of the different approaches to assessing information, collecting data, it's a more complicated picture. And in terms of which institutions are in a situation to bring together both the economic development interests and the protection needs to try and balance between the two. So obviously in different fields, be it climate change adaptation, be it development of infrastructure, it's necessary to coordinate to avoid unintended consequences from unilateral actions. But it should be taken also as an opportunity, not just see the constraints that beyond the country's territory you can't influence so much, but also it's an opportunity to more optimally locate the developments through cooperation. What is often behind the shortcomings to address these intersectoral challenges is there's no adequate legal basis, there's no institutions, or the mandates are too limited to effectively respond, or maybe the institutions don't have broad enough constituency, or decision-making procedures are not well worked out, and and effective, and of course also the enforcement capacities. So the legal frameworks as part of the governance setting influence at different levels. There are the framework conventions such as the UNEP Water Convention, but also then specific agreements. It doesn't reduce the value of basin level agreements and bilateral agreements. And of course there's a big diversity of joint institutions for transboundary cooperation in terms of how many economic sectors their mandate covers, whether they have a more coordinating or more also implementing role. So the capacities to address these intersectoral conflicts and frictions it differs greatly. But actually in UNEP we are in the process together with partners to assess water, food, energy ecosystems nexus in a set of transboundary basins, and new insights will emerge in the next year and a half from this work. So the information basis, the intersectoral and inter-resource dynamics to allow better planning, more effective resource management, this is really a key early steps that then helps to develop policies in a more coherent way, take decisions that are well informed by the implications to the other sectors. And it's not enough to look at the situation now, but also what's the outlook for the future, how climate variability and change will affect the resource scarcity, for example. To us in this assessment, the river basin organizations or other joint bodies, when they are in place, they are really the natural counterpart and platform for us to carry out this nexus assessment in cooperation. And participation has been underlined by many presenters. It's not only what comes out as the assessment conclusions, but the process is really crucial, like bringing the different sectors from all the riparian countries together and to look at the plans of the sectors, what do they entail, or are they compatible with each other, what do they assume about the availability of resources from the other sectors, and how to better reconcile what kind of opportunities there are concretely. And it has turned out in these workshops quite challenging to get the ideas out, what could be done better at different levels, whether it's about adjustments to policies, whether it's just about way infrastructure is operated, how it can better accommodate different uses. As part of this assessment, we also have a institutional assessment component, which we are now developing and improving, involving looking at the main actors, the extent of regulation in relation to uses, configuration of actors, what kind of links they have, more public or private law basis, how robust they are, and then looking at specific hotspots at different levels, transboundary and national, how they play out. I just wanted to point out a couple of things about the Sava Basin, which is now topical, not as a kind of ideal example, but just it illustrates many of these points that are relevant to the Nexus response. Such organizations that have a multi-sectoral scope of work, like water management issues at large, but navigation, tourism, and so on, and that are mandated to prepare integrated plans and run information systems. They can add value, they can help transmit also from the regional level, like the EU instruments implementation is something where the Sava Commission supports the parties, which are some EU member states, some not, to to carry out this preparable basin management plans and the public participation that goes with it. So in that sense, it's a nice example, but also the local basin level public participation. So can have capacity building benefits, but also supporting coordination and stakeholder participation. Also, this transboundary intersectoral work can happen at different levels. The Sava Commission, for example, has cooperated with the ICPDR on the Danube level, and some guidelines have been developed on, for example, inland navigation and environment, reconciling between these, and guiding principles on sustainable hydropower development in the Danube basin, and then supporting countries in putting this into practice is very useful for reducing intersectoral tensions. About joint bodies, we from UNEC we work closely with river basin organizations and similar, and with leadership of Germany and Finland, recently 2 workshops were organized, and we had a broad participation of joint bodies. We also had a session on intersectoral issues. So against this background, we discussed a set of principles of organization and activities of joint bodies that improve their efficiency of operation and how a more mature level of cooperation can be reached. And many of these points are very relevant to the Nexus. I'll just highlight a few, like a sufficiently broad competence. This is, of course, it's a very context-specific, depends on what the uses are and many other things. Broad representation of national authorities and organizational structure, again, depending on the mandate, but ideally such a structure that allows also putting into practice, implementing the decisions, not only making them. Flexibility has value as the dynamic interlinkages of the Nexus were pointed out by previous speakers, that over time challenges change, policy objectives change, that the scope can broaden. Like, for example, the Sava framework agreement has been strengthened later by protocols on navigation regime and flood response, for example. This regular exchange of information and consultation is invaluable. It's really one of the key functions of these institutions to provide a basis, ideally a broad integrated basis for action. And this mandate to identify potential benefits from transboundary cooperation in a broad sense, economic, social, environmental, geopolitical aspects. And such joint bodies really can facilitate assessment of impacts from planned developments and provide a platform for negotiating between countries about them. And also what is important is that not only that when developments go ahead, constructions are made, that the process doesn't stop there. There should be a longer term monitoring of what the impacts are. And then the provision for public participation in different ways, maybe through observer status, targeted information channels, and so on. Or just to conclude a few points, there are some ways how such joint institutions for transboundary cooperation can alleviate the negative aspects in the resource nexus and also enhance the positive, appropriately broad representation of sectors, firstly, potentially broadening mandate gradually to reflect uses and pressures, also maybe to take initially hesitant riparian parties on board later on, develop guidelines, also ensure their observance and putting into practice, and then this capacity to collect information in a consistent way across across the basin as basis for further action, and communication and coordination arrangements that are well thought through and adapted to that particular case, and well-developed mechanisms for public participation. Thanks.
Thank you, Annukka, for giving us, showing us how river basin organizations could be an opportunity for implementing the Nexus and what needs to be done for that to happen. That was very useful. And a few questions. I'll take 2-3 questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for showing the intricacies of transboundary water resources management. I wonder, however, whether those difficulties which are inherent in the transboundary management may have a stimulating and positive effect of nexus thinking. If you have several riparian countries who has to argue and debate and agree within a transboundary context, doesn't it automatically force these countries to think in a nexus context, to speak with one voice? And this cannot be only the agricultural lobby's voice from country A and the hydropower lobby from countries B and the environmental lobby from country C. So I wonder whether you have experience to see that this transboundary and international context forces, at least at national level, some kind of nexus thinking and mentality to emerge.
Depends on the composition of the joint body, but for example, to me it seems that, say, the Sava Commission, for example, that has commissioners from the different countries that represent different ministries, be it agriculture and water, be it transport, environment. It has a intersectoral composition, so that should be actually beneficial also from the point of view of national coordination. But of course, you can institutionalize it to a certain degree. But then beyond certain point, it also depends on the influence of the commissioners, of individuals, and how effectively they communicate in their end at the national end. But yes, I would think so.
Johannes Barth from Erlangen University. It's actually a comment for the last two speakers, to you and to Claudia Pahl-Wostl. I think, again, we have to think of the role of the cities. You were talking a lot about flooding. And if you think of it, flooding hits the cities the most hardest. I think a landscape can tolerate a flood, but a city, you create much more problems. And also with the future water development, currently, the way it works, we bring clean water into a city and dirty water leaves the city. So we have to think more of recycling of water within the city. Currently, the only one I can think of is Singapore. They have a strong recycling aspect, but perhaps somebody else knows another city this way. Thanks.
Well, of course, this intersectoral coordination, coordination has an integration needs to happen at different scales. One good aspect about the river basin organizations is that they have, through the public participation, ideally quite a broad stakeholder involvement. Also from the communities.
Yes, I can agree that both cities have challenges. They are also interesting in terms of their dynamics. We currently also work on a network with cities as agents of change, where often cities also in the climate change adaptation debate, where cities already have been really proactive. However, I think you should always embed the city in the larger context of the surrounding landscape, so not looking at cities in isolation. But I agree, cities are both interesting, something happens there, and often there is also much innovative potential.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you very much, Annukka. Now, we've run a little bit out of time. I thought that we'd have another, like a plenary discussion with our keynote speakers. Janos, do you think we still have about 10 minutes to have them to say one thing, or?
If you convince the people not to drink coffee, yes, otherwise no.
Okay. I would like to ask you, Claudia and others, just after to come up here so that they all see you. Can you come up here? Yeah, on the table. If you could come very quickly up here so that they see you. And I would like just to ask each one of you to say one or two things that you think from the presentations of others, both the presentation of others and yours, what you think should be the take-home message related to governance. How do we tackle that governance so that it helps us to implement the Nexus? Annukka, I'll start with you, and please pass on the mic. One or two points that you think are take-home messages related to governance that you think could help us implement the Nexus.
Well, one consideration that comes to mind, often I've heard such such ambitions about very, to a large degree, integrated policies and devoted institutions for integrated planning and so on. Sometimes I feel that it's better maybe to start small and say improve communication between sectors at different levels and coordination, and sort of gradually improve things.
Thank you. So start small and move gradually to upscale it.
Yes, I partly repeat also messages I had already in my talk. It's important also in IWM, there was always as a potential problem was the need for this coordination mega bureaucracies. So we need to really rethink how coordination works and also give up the idea that everything can be from the beginning, which anyway, you could say many policies are experiments, but generally politicians don't acknowledge. So we need to much more consciously think that this is also learning, societal learning processes, and in order to move there, what I said, that also more starting from regional approaches, could be cities embedded in their surroundings, but really regional approaches where problems are prevalent, where sometimes innovations already are going, but these regions obviously operate in the constraints of national and global frameworks, but connecting regions, comparing their lessons and supporting here that lessons can be shared, I think would be an important element to support this transformation.
Yeah, listening to the three other presentations, I would argue that we all have been talking about 4 points at the end of the day, and then differentiating other arguments. But the first point was that for have any kind of transformation, you need a new kind of perspective and paradigm, development paradigm. So you spoke about resilience as a principle and the direction in which to walk to. And we all talked about the nexus dimension. So a vision is needed to get transformation going. The second issue was then reflecting on institutional designs. And we have been discussing many different types of institutional settings. So having the institutional design right was the second point. The third point was then innovation. This is what Joachim, you mentioned very strongly. And you talked about learning. So learning and innovation are obviously going together from different perspectives. And this is a third dimension of transformation. The last thing is then cultural innovations, social innovations. Well-being concepts, new lifestyles, how to organize cities in a different way, not only from a productive perspective, efficiency perspective, but the way we organize our well-being in our societies.
I think we need to further strengthen the evidence base that investment in Nexus pays off. And that's a task for us in the research communities. And secondly, we need to think hard and act on alliance building. Alliance building to get the Nexus agenda moved forward across actors in the public sector, with the private sector and civil society.
Thank you very much to all of you. And our experts, I think you summarized what we discussed and the thinking that was put into the various presentations and questions answered. I would like again to thank you and to have the privilege of having your presentations and to share with us your knowledge. Thank you very much. And to the participants, thank you again. And my apologies that we ran a little bit over time and we had to eat into your coffee time. But I hope with the information we got from our experts here, it was worth it. Thank you very much.